Hey, this is Rob. Welcome to episode 2 of Inside the Line with Rob and my guest, Anna Sonoda. I had done a podcast with her, trying to think, a few months ago on Joel's show, and unbelievable guest. And then she authored this book, Duck, Duck, Groom. And I figured out after talking to her and reading the book that I'd been doing it all wrong with my kids when they're little. I just assumed everyone was bad. And that was very time consuming, and probably a lot of people didn't like me for it. And then in reading her book, she just got some great insight. So we're going to bring her in because I think this is well worth it. This is an unbelievable tool for every parent out there, because it's the largest nightmare as a parent. And I know that from having 4 kids. So here we are. Going to add Anna to the stage. Anna, good afternoon.
Hi, Rob. Happy Memorial Day weekend to you.
Yes. She was just reminding me, we were talking before the show, that there may be some of you that are sitting in traffic right now or trying to get away that have found yourself with some spare time in the car or whatever. Hopefully not watching and driving, though I've been known to do that a couple of times, but maybe listening, or some of, if you're a passenger in the car and then you're getting to watch this. So welcome, Anna. I want to ask you to do an intro just from where you came from to how you got to where you are now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me on the show today, Rob. I'm so excited about this conversation and the opportunity to talk to you and your audience. My name is Anna Sonoda. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. That means that I have a master's in social work. And while I was getting my degree, I had the opportunity to be in a clinical environment. And the clinical environment I selected was to counsel convicted sex offenders, which may sound like a shock to anybody listening, but I really wanted to work with couples and possibly go into sex therapy or intimacy counseling. And I thought, if I can handle the conversations around this extreme element, then it's going to be very easy for me to manage your average married couple. Little did I know, Rob, that this was going to turn into my mission and my purpose. So what happened is, after I ended that counseling work, I had the opportunity to be in a myriad of other settings, but I kept coming back to something. I also am a parent. I have 5 kids. And what I realized was that there was a gap between what I knew as a clinician and what the everyday parents that I came in contact with, whether it was at the playground, at the park, or at schools, or sports activities for our children. And I realized, after the same conversation occurring again and again, that there was a mismatch. You know, we have so many wonderful researchers, clinicians, individuals in academia who are doing incredible work around child sex abuse prevention. And one of the things that I've realized is that, unfortunately, sometimes that intel, that information, gets tracked in those environments, and we don't put it back down to the ground floor. So I really set out in 2022 to change that. And I thought, we need a document. We need something that's going to explain the grooming process, because over 90% of the time, survivors of child sexual abuse report being groomed. So what we really need to do is prevent grooming if we're going to prevent child sexual abuse. So I hired a developmental editor and set out to write that book. And that book is called Duck, Duck, Groom: Understanding How a Child Becomes a Target. And what I spend my time doing now is educating people, training people about what is grooming, because for too long it's been elusive and confusing. And I'm trying to make it easy to understand so that it can be easy to interrupt.
That's great. And again, like I looked at it, 4 kids, they're all in their 20s now. But I looked at it like, okay, and being in the FBI, you see the worst. That's the problem with being in law enforcement. You see the worst, and you see that all the bad things happen from folks that you always hear, oh, I never suspected him, never saw it coming, like all these things. So I just went out with the attitude, I'm going to assume everyone's a predator until I know them better. And even then I was like, oh, it's still the person that no one guessed was the one doing it. But when I started listening to your book, I'm like, wait a second, here you're pointing out these are the grooming, because everyone that gets led down that road, it starts with grooming, the targeting and grooming. And if you can identify the grooming, then you can stop it. And that's also in the,
Exactly.
you give great examples, because a lot of people sometimes they will notice something, they will see something that's not right. One, you have to empower them to act on it. You have to give them that this is not normal and you should say something. We'll talk about that in a bit. But you also give really good examples of what actually to say in the book, like word for word, because some people may, I'm not shy of words. I'll go up and say something to anyone. But some people aren't, and they don't know exactly what to say to not offend. Like, and you give example after example in this, and then you also give examples. You'll go through the book later, but you give the overall, and then you do specifically like schools and medical and all these other things, and then you talk about age groups and really where to watch out for. And I'm like, God, if this book was only out when my kids were younger, it would have, I think it would have helped me in how I dealt with things, and how I'm like, oh, I can identify the grooming. I don't have to just assume every person that I'm looking at is the worst thing around.
Yeah, and Rob, one of the things I think about as I listen to what you're saying is we jump from meeting people to reporting them. And there's a wide space in between those two. There's an enormous gulf of maybe suspicion or gut feelings or information that really does come up against our basic understanding of what's appropriate, what's professional, what is acceptable behavior on the part not only of adults but also older kids. And one of the ways that we, through our conversation today and through this mission of mine, is we can actually give people the encouragement. Sometimes all you need, this from being in law enforcement, sometimes all you need is to push that person, to encourage that person to say, you're not the judge, you're not the investigator, you're not the lawyers in the case, but by giving this information over to law enforcement, you allow them to do their job and possibly take a predation situation and squash it before it can become something more intense. Because one of the important parts that I learned from sex offenders was it is a process. Grooming is an intentional, selective process. And so once you get on that trajectory, if you will, if you know what to look for, you can interrupt it. You can recognize what is outlying behavior, what doesn't fit here. And then you can intervene, whether it's through calling the authorities, calling a supervisor, or simply removing your child from an environment and bringing attention to behavior that is unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, and that's great stuff, because um I learned that early on. Like, when one of the first cases, when I was in the Miami field office as an FBI guy, I was on the fugitive squad, but we had a 7-year-old boy, Jimmy Rice, go missing. And the whole office basically stopped and was on this case. And it was just a horrible crime. But he got approached from a bus stop, and his bus stop was 50 yards from his house, and was abducted. And unfortunately, horrible things happened. But all I thought was that wasn't the first time this person has approached someone. You just don't think, I'm going to do this. You test it. You go up and you roll down your window and you say something to a kid getting off the bus. And then they pay attention. Does anyone say anything to them? Does anything happen? And they are constantly, one, improving their technique, two, testing the waters, both on the victim and the response to what they're doing. Because by the time they actually do something, they probably tried it a number of times. And I think same thing with grooming that you talk about is they'll do a little test and see if the child says something, And if it comes back, it's funny. I always use analogies. I try to put it, and on the cyber world, I always say, hey, look, you don't have to be faster than the bear. You got to be faster than your person at the campsite that when the bear comes, because you just have to be, like I always say, a harder target. And I used to look at, and talk to some of the kids' parents, and they'd have on the back of their car all the stick figures that were really popular. And that's
And the
bad.
names, sometimes
Well,
names.
it's when I see names, I'm like, oh my God, you're giving so much information. And I forget what TV show they tested some kids with the parents' approval. And they said, oh, my kids have been told never get in a car with strangers. And they pull up and they tell the kid, like, oh, your mom, Allison, she had to take Mikey to the doctor and the dog's spot was hurt, whatever. And the child got in the car,
Oh
and
my
then they
gosh.
pulled the child out and said, well, why did you go with him if you know to undergo a stranger? Like, well, he knew my mom, he knew my brother and my dog's name. I didn't think he was a stranger. So all that information that you're putting on those stickers, you're providing predators information to do things like that. And they practice. They absolutely do practice. And they'll I always say, like, if someone's watching a bus stop, when I pulled up to the bus stop, I would look to see if anyone's looking at the bus stop, if anyone's parked there that shouldn't be. I just did a bunch of news stuff on, unfortunately, the shooting in Washington, D.C., and the subject was pacing outside. And as a security guy, I'm like, that to me is a clue. Like, he's pacing for a reason. He's nervous. Something's going on. Go out and talk to him and really gather information. Does his story make sense? But it's the same thing here. When you see someone that shouldn't be doing something, in that book, I don't know if you read it, Gavin DeBecker's Gift of Fear.
Of course,
So
yes.
again, he talks about, the propensity for violence, and every one of the victims in there, they always say, I never saw it coming. And when he goes back and interviews them, they actually did see it coming, but because of social norms of not being rude, of not, because all these people are helpful, as you talk about, like, oh, I can drive your kid to school when you can't. Well, again, that's getting them alone time with your child, and they always want to be useful to be in their lives that way. And it's one of those things that, like, it's that person that makes it also hard to say something to when those yellow flags are coming up.
Yeah, and when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking too of the fact that almost every caring parent wants to do right by their children. As a dad yourself, you know that you would do anything for your kids. And too often, predators exploit the very things that we as parents are trying to do for our children, whether it's putting them in activities or letting them have opportunities in the community or around the neighborhood. And predators are selective. And we must start the conversation there, because that is something that very few people, even though they may be aware of it, they may not really digest what that means. That means that not every kid is groomed and not every kid is selected for targeting. So as a mom, as a parent, one of the things I need to do as a starting point is assess, what are some vulnerabilities I have? Am I what are my scheduling conflicts? What are the things that may make me vulnerable to somebody who could swoop in and be very helpful? Because you're absolutely right when you say that predators go out of their way to hand select. And even if they might attempt to start the grooming process, that does not mean that it has to end in child sexual abuse, whether that be hands-on or in online cases. We've seen an explosion of online harassment and sexual exploitation of minors. So I know that that's an important topic for your audience, and one that you're very familiar with, being in law enforcement as well.
Yeah. So nitty gritty. I'm just learning this. It's my second podcast. So I actually figured out how to get your question up there. Um, can you answer this question? Do you see it? You see it?
When does grooming become actionable, meaning a person can contact law enforcement? I love this question. Thank you, Nitty Gritty, for this question.
And Nitty, one, it's a great question, but as the first question on the show, I'm going to go ahead and get you one of the audiobooks. So if you email me at rob@insidethelinewithrob.com, and that's Rob, insidethelineWithRob.com. If you email me, I'll get you your audiobook. But go
Awesome.
ahead, answer the question now.
So I'm so glad you brought this question up. So grooming, this like very mysterious gray matter that nobody seems to be able until this point to sort of put a finger on, is not always illegal. So you must be saying, well, Anna, what are you talking about? You're asking us to report something that may or may not be illegal. And you're exactly right. Different states have differing views of whether or not these things are crimes. So, for example, there are states who have deemed grooming behaviors, let's say a teacher giving a gift or providing money or taking a kid on their own, or contacting them over their own personal devices, as grooming. Now, this is not a federal law. This is not something that applies in all states. And we're seeing an enormous disparity between states on what is deemed as a misdemeanor grooming charge and what are things that are just uncomfortable. Just as nitty gritty is highlighting with the question, we can't always arrest somebody just for flattering our child or favoring our child or demonstrating other behaviors that I would categorize as grooming, because they're not necessarily illegal. But it doesn't mean that we have to wait until a law has been broken. It does mean that we can call attention to that behavior, whether it's an employer, whether it's somebody within your religious environment, whether it's somebody in a medical setting. There are other people, maybe somebody who has hired that person, somebody who works with that person, somebody who supervises that individual, who we can flag that behavior. You know, Rob, you mentioned earlier that yellow flag behavior. And I would categorize a lot of what is the ramp up to hands-on child sexual abuse as being noteworthy, but not necessarily illegal. I'd love to hear what you have to say, Rob, about the law enforcement side of grooming and when you understand it to be actionable based on
Yeah,
your experience.
it's one of those that is tough because, like, the complaints, and they have so many cases and everything else. And I think if you get to the right squads and the people working that, but again, it's bringing it to other people's attention too. Because one, someone else may have gone in and talked to them, and now it's not just one; it's several. And two, I think it's one of those things when things start adding up and more people come in, you start getting attention. But once you start doing that, and like you said, supervisors, principals, and all these other people, once they start like checking in and asking questions, that again may get them off the path that they're going down. Not that they're not going to go after another child, but they're definitely going to start saying, well, wait a second. I mean, that's part of the test. Someone noticed, someone said something, type of thing. And it's funny, after having read this book, I asked my kids, did you ever think you were part of being groomed, that either stopped or didn't happen, or happened and we didn't know about? And their answers were no. But I think part of it was one, their mom was always at school with them. Four kids, and they were very tightly, like last three were born within 26 months of each other. And she was always at the school, always had the other kids in tow, was very much around. And then there was me. I was gone a lot, but when I was home, try to get to everything I can. And then I guess, if your dad, the FBI sniper, is there, I'm not sure, someone who wants to, groom your child is going to go down that road. And I think that was part of it, but the involvement of it. But and that's where the vulnerabilities are, especially like with single moms, who are just trying to work and do all these things and have this need for people to be helpful, are more vulnerable just because it's required that way. But like I said, I wasn't sure. I've had a couple of things that we'll talk about later that I'm like, wow, that's way out of line. And I went and said something right away, and didn't put up with it. And I wasn't afraid to piss anyone off either. But unfortunately, not everyone has that ability to do that. You're trying to make ends meet, and you're trying to do things, and you need help. And then someone comes along and says that. so it's one of those like, but the more people that ask about it, or if you go over and ask a coach or a doctor or something, and you then ask someone else in the school or other coaches or other parents, and that gets noticed, I think that is again something that will deter something from happening. So it may not be going straight to law enforcement, but you can also do that and just say, I've seen this. I don't know if this person's on your radar. If he is, I have noticed something and you can come and talk to me. That may be enough that if someone else goes to him and that detective, hears it, says, wait a second, that's the third person that said this. I think something's up. Can really help out on that.
Rob, I'm so glad you brought that point up, because I think it's important that we remember that predators, at least the ones that I have had experience counseling and working with, are serial offenders. These are not individuals who just found one child. By and large, they found and attempted assaulting multiple children. So for many families or many parents, they think that's astounding. How can individuals still be not incarcerated, not having any criminal record, no charges? Because the reality is most child sex abuse never gets reported. Only 30% of child sex abuse gets reported. What that means is that 70% of the time, nobody reports to law enforcement. So you're absolutely right that those gut checks, those little things that pop up that you think, this feels a little bit like flattery, this feels like favoritism, this feels like forbidden fruits. When we get into forbidden fruits, it's a little more interesting because those things are often actionable legally. If somebody provides your child alcohol or takes your child off campus without getting parental permission or things like that. However, the important part is awareness. So in our conversation today, if the only thing you take away is increasing your awareness of grooming behaviors, then that could move the needle tremendously, because the majority of time, 70% of child sex abusers have up to 9 victims. So that means that as a person out in the world, as a mom out in the world, I don't necessarily know what place I am in the line, so to speak. And I don't want to allow that to continue. So I can do something. I can call Department of Family and Corrections. I can call Child Protective Services. I can call an administrator at the school and say, were you aware that this teacher is acting this way? This is atypical in our experience at being in this school. And that can sometimes be the difference between a potential predator staying in the environment or gathering their things and heading to a neighboring community or town.
Absolutely. So, okay, and this is like I'm learning what Joel and COE go through with all these questions and paying attention stuff. So, if you read this, this is a 2-part post on the question. So, if you read this one, and then I'm going to go to the second one where the question is, and if you can let me know when you're done with that, and then I'll go to the second one.
Ex-brother was sexually assaulted by a male family friend.
Okay, and then there's the second part.
Just one out of
and Lorna, I'll get to your question next after this one. So what kind of hit me on this was stomach issues, because you talk about that in there. But so how would you answer Gulf Coast Girl's question here?
Well, thank you very much, Gulf Coast Girl, for your question. That's a devastating situation. One of the things that we come across, right, is that everybody has their own individual story, oftentimes with childhood sexual abuse. The statistics are not watertight, but on average, 1 in 4 women has been sexually abused before the age of 18, and 1 in 7 men have been sexually abused before the age of 18. Now, these are based on surveys of adults looking back. And one thing that's important to note is that the average age of first disclosure in the United States is the age of 52. So what that means is that most survivors of childhood sexual abuse have not gone to therapy for it, received any sort of resources, and have usually not told anybody. So it's not surprising in this case that we have an adult who was in a situation where they had a childhood sexual trauma, and then they went on to abuse somebody in their home life, now in their family life. Now, one thing I will say is that oftentimes we have a myth that individuals who were abused as children will automatically become abusers when they grow up. That is a myth. It can happen, obviously, especially when we review those statistics of 1 in 7 males and 1 in 4 females. The thing I'd like to point out is most of the time when I've been going around the country speaking to survivors, the most vocal, the most attentive individuals are those survivors, especially those male survivors who go out of their way to say, this happened to me, and there is no way it's ever going to happen to anyone under my watch. So in this circumstance that you bring up, Coastal Girl, I think one of the things we have to remember is when parents are living in a household with their children, we have a few different, there are some assets there. One of the assets is watching our own children. You know what's normal for your kid. I live in the house with my kids, so does my spouse. We have the opportunity to notice what are the changes that are coming about. In your question, you identified that the child had stomach issues that lasted for almost a year. And this is where we really need to collaborate with pediatricians, other individuals, maybe from the school system or within our own network in our community, because stomach issues or sudden changes in behaviors of our children can often flag us to things that are not right, whether it's sexual trauma, whether it's bullying, whether it's another situation. But it's keen to be aware of what is normal for my child. And when we're talking about what are the normal categories, we're thinking about things like diet, food, weight, appearance, hygiene. We're thinking about things like sleep hygiene. Can the child sleep on their own? Do they suddenly change course and say, I need to sleep in the room with mom and dad, or I need to sleep with the light on, or I need to go back to thumb sucking? There may be bedwetting that arises even after the child has demonstrated that they can go through the night without wetting their pants. These are some of the things that parents have the opportunity to look for, especially when we're evaluating, is something maybe happening? And this is where it's so crucial, Rob, for everyone to have, when you're living in the house with children, for you to have those open avenues of communication. So that means that the phones go away, devices go away. You have that uninterrupted time where you and your child are speaking openly. And if for some reason they don't want to speak to you about something, you could use toys to illustrate things that are happening. You could even have a picture session where you draw a picture of how you're feeling and what's been going on with your day, and you invite your child to do the same. And then you have a conversation. You use that as an invitation to discuss it. Many adults that I speak to have questioned, did the people in my life know? Did they have any suspicions about the abuse that was happening to me in the household growing up? And unfortunately, this information about grooming and about child sexual abuse in really open, uh, these sorts of conversations have been limited. We are in an age and a time where we have the opportunity to use a vehicle like this program to highlight what should we be looking for, because we can't expect, whether it's moms or dads or grandmas and grandpas, to see something that we don't explain to them. It's that disconnect that we talked about earlier, that we've given parents just enough to be petrified and paranoid. We haven't given them the rest of the story. And the rest of the story is that grooming is observable and it's interruptible. But we must do a better job of servicing the community and teaching them what grooming actually looks like.
Okay, let me go back. So next question from Lorna, who's actually from Surviving the Survivor. So appreciate you probably watched their Friday show and then jumped over here. Appreciate your support for this new show. And this is always tough because I'm trying to like read a bunch of things and they're writing away. What about the increasing number of high school teachers having inappropriate relationships with pupils?
Thank you, Lorna, for bringing that up. Seems to be a rampant issue. I wonder, just like you, is this something that is new, or is this something that's always been there and we've never had as much of a reporting system? Because nowadays, teens and tweens in 2025, they have cell phones. They often have ways to have bridges of connection with adults that were never an available option, at least when I was growing up. I don't know about you, Rob, but certainly not when I was growing up. So, what often happens, especially when we deal with high school teachers or high school administrators who may be acting out against children, is the abuse doesn't necessarily start at school, but the relationship, the connection, the introduction starts at school. And then those potential predators take the relationship off campus, whether it's through personal devices, which is the number one way, direct messaging or DMs for anybody who doesn't know that term, liking somebody, following somebody on social media, and then taking the conversation to really inappropriate exploitative measures. I have actually seen many states are working on legislation to have legal recourse for teachers who are in positions of power, who are exploiting children or attempting to abuse children that they teach. And that is something that I think we should see rolled out on a federal level. Again, this is not rocket science. This is straightforward. A teacher doesn't need touching. They don't need to be following you on Instagram in order to teach you properly. What do you think, Rob, about these high school teachers offending?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, like you said, and I don't think like, everyone you hear like, oh, I want to be friends with them. Like that's not your job. I don't even think as a parent, I want to have a relationship with them, but I don't think friend is it in any of those. Coach, mentor, parent, like that's not appropriate. Because then you start getting into, oh, I was just being a friend. I was just doing this. I was just doing that. And it's all, I think, a slippery slope as that goes on. And then they can start testing it and pushing it. And then the excuse is, oh, I was just being friendly. I touch everyone. I do this. And it allows them to go down that road. And that's trouble. And again, it's one of those, every time I always say, like, if it doesn't seem right, and another book I read and recommend is Blink by Gladwell, where he talks about like your intuition, that you see something that's not right and the hair on the back of your neck stands up. And the more experience you have with that, and a new parent may not have as much experience. By the fourth one, I was, probably a lot more lenient. I know she's probably watching, and she got away with a lot more than my oldest did, who wasn't allowed to do anything ever. And the last one, like, oh, here's the keys to the car. We'll see you next week or whatever. But a new parent may not understand some of those rights and wrongs. But when you after the fourth kid, and you're like, wait a second, that's not right. The hair kind of on the back of your neck. I had one. I remember I was in North Carolina. We were building a house, and we were living in a friend's house. We were renting it while the house was built. And every Friday we would go over there to take a look at what was going on. And this Friday, sure enough, the builder was there and some of the subcontractors were there, and the kids were running around. And I'm trying to think, my oldest was probably, this was like 2000, was probably 10 around that age. Was it? Yeah, I think so. Oh God, I'm like, losing time and numbers. But what was odd was I was talking to the builder and a couple workers, and she came up, and I saw this. I was watching them, and the look he gave my oldest literally instantaneously stopped me in my tracks. The hair literally went up on the back of my neck. And I said something to my wife, said, I made like, oh, I know you got to go home with the kids, but I'll be back in a little bit. And the fact that she didn't have to be back, she knew something. And I think by my, my tone and everything else, she knew exactly that I wanted her and the kids out of there. And she left, and I grabbed the builder, an excuse to show him something. And I said, I don't know who that is. I don't know what job he's doing on my house, but he is never to be on my property again. And he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, the look he gave my daughter I I don't want him ever. You have to, and it turns out it was his cousin. And he was like, I said, look, never on my property again, ever. And I think he also knew what I did. And he took the hint. But it was one of those times that I really saw something that was was that powerful that my intuitions were like, stop this and end it now. And again, I wasn't afraid to say anything. And the people that I was talking to knew probably from my tone and context and everything else that I was not kidding, that this was not going to be around, including, and I'm sure my kid, my oldest, probably noticed something, maybe not as much as my wife did, but something was wrong. And I went home and told my wife like that. I don't want to ever see him again. Go over there with the kids. If he's ever there, call me and, let me know.
And I'm really glad you illustrated that with the story because it illustrates too that the behavior is an outlier. Not everyone who was working on the house gave the same look to your child. So, in the same way that when we're thinking about whether it's high school teachers or coaches or religious figures or medical professionals, predators stand out because they behave differently. By and large, most people don't want to molest children. They don't want to be around children who aren't their own unless, it's their job or they're, inspired to mentor. But these individuals who are going out of their way to be alone with kids or be in environments where without supervision are acting differently, just like that individual with your daughter acted differently, behaved differently than the rest of them, and it stood out to you because you were attentive and aware. And that's what we must do. We must encourage parents not to be paranoid, but to be in a state of awareness about the individuals that you come in contact with and those individuals you entrust to take care of your children or to be around your children or lead them.
It's funny in law enforcement, and I'm trying to think. I think it was Jeff Cooper always had this. People in what zone they're in, and white was just oblivious to everything. Cops usually live in the yellow to orange zone, just because, like, if I go, Friday's the most often is the day that most bank robberies happen, mostly because people want, who rob banks want money for the weekend or whatever. So every time, like, I went into a bank, one, I made sure I had my gun and an extra magazine. And Fridays, I was absolutely like, okay, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to assume it's going to get robbed, so that I'm in this orange zone, so to speak. And I think that's important. Like when you're around your kids, that like it's okay to be in yellow or white at times, but especially when new people are around or something is in that environment, that you up your situational awareness to what's going on with your kids. And I would say, like, a lot of times with security, sometimes if especially if you're doing like executive protection, it's hard to filter everything out because you got so much going on. And the real good security folks have someone across the street watching who's watching security. So it's the same thing. Like when I was doing this with the builder and the subcontractor, I wasn't looking at my kids. I was looking at them. And when I saw that reaction, it was instantaneous. So again, I was observing what they were putting out. And I think that's big. Sometimes, it's tough to live in that world because it takes mental processing, and you get very, like, when you have to do it. When I was living undercover, it was so mentally grueling because I was always careful what I was talking about. I did learn to think before I talked, doing that, but it was so mentally grueling to stay in that, orange zone so long. But when you have an interaction like that, maybe up your awareness to see what's going on. And then, you again, listening to your instincts on some of it.
And I think one of the things that I want families and parents to remember, because parents are busy. You remember how it was, Rob, when you had young kids. And as somebody with a lot of young kids in the house, I can relate to your listeners who might be thinking, oh my gosh, like, just make it easier on me. Don't give me extra work to do. And the three things I tell parents is show up, look up, and speak up. That's really by and large what we have to do, just by being present, like you were present at the house, like, sitting on the sidelines at an event, at a game, at an event for your child or in your community, just your presence alone can often communicate to a potential predator, okay, I'm going to bypass that kid and I'm going to move on to another kid with lower fences around them, if you will. We talked about this earlier, right? That this sense of vulnerability, the child who maybe doesn't have somebody who's watching them or doesn't have somebody reliable who's present might be more vulnerable. So if that's you, if that's the situation, then who could we get possibly to show up to events? Is there a grandmother? Is there a neighbor who you can say, I know you're going to go and be watching Timmy. Do you mind also watching Jimmy while you're there? And I'll take turns with you next week. This is where we must get back to a civilization that understands that it is going to take a group effort. This is a public health issue, and we need a public health response, not just, oh, I'm going to keep my kids safe and you're responsible for keeping your kids safe. No, on the contrary, we must do what we can to unify with other like-minded families who are aware of this issue and act responsibly.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I look back, I'm like, wow, I could have probably done more for some of the parents that couldn't be there all the time. Making them know that you were looking at. It's funny. My neighbor that lived next to us, they had two kids, and they were both teachers. And in the summers they go on vacation, and they'd always say, "Hey, can you watch the house for us?" And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." And actually, it was a summer. My kids would go down to the beach in North Carolina where they live now, or did live, with their mom, and I'd be home kind of by myself for 4 or 5 weeks. But I was coming out one morning. It was 5 a.m. I had a big up in Virginia, a big long driveway, and I drive down and I see this car at the neighbor's house, and it's kind of going back and forth, and then it drives up the driveway, and I'm like, what? And I knew they were gone, and so I'm in my FBI Tahoe. I go to the driveway, I flip my red and blue lights on, I fly up the driveway, and I'm like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he's like, and he obviously a bit scared. And he turns out he worked for the trash company, and they had, I guess, a broken trash bin, and they usually replace it when it's out on the street. So he was out there looking for it, and they drove up the driveway to see if it was up there to replace it. And I said, it all made sense. And he had his card, with that on there. I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Yeah, they just went away for the day and asked me to watch the house. I didn't want to say they were gone for the whole summer, but they went away for the day and asked me to watch the house." And he goes, "God, I wish someone would watch my house like that when I'm gone." But it is one of those things that you have to, and you mention it in the book about, if you see something happening to someone else's child, not being afraid to tell the parent or who's ever interacting them that you noticed something, that you saw something or whatever, because again, just because their parents couldn't be there at that time, that you kind of take up that, the guard dog, so to speak. And we the book about sheepdogs and sheep and wolves. Not everyone can be the sheepdog, and if you can do that for others, I think it's great.
Yeah, I think we actually have a moral obligation to do that. I had a conversation with my 7-year-old, and she was asking me what day of the week it was, and I was thinking, wow, children are vulnerable not because they're 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 incapable, but they are, they're out to lunch, right? They're thinking about other things, they're distracted, they're in tune with their own world. They're like, oh, what day is it? Do I go to school today? How many more days do I have to be in my schedule or my routine? So one of the things we have to remember is that children are not always going to be aware of what grooming is, what it looks like, or what it feels like. So that's our job as the adults, is to know what grooming is so that we're not putting the load of responsibility on the shoulders of vulnerable children who may be completely distracted. They may be open to attention from somebody who makes them feel good or makes them feel special. And this is reasonable. Any of us would be vulnerable to that attention. And we must remember that children are inherently vulnerable, and so they cannot always protect themselves. This obviously shifts a bit when we're thinking about 9 to 12-year-olds, 13 to 17-year-olds. Doesn't mean that they don't need protection. It just means that we need to bring them in a little bit more to the strategies for being street smart when dealing with adults or individuals in a role who may exploit that role or that privilege of access with them to harm them in some way.
Yeah, it is. I remember I was watching there was a episode of Oprah. I think it was Oprah. It's one of the talk shows, and they talked about this guy that was arrested that had an entire setup in his basement for abducting people and doing awful things to them. And I wanted my oldest to watch it, and she was probably 11 or 12 or 13, somewhere in that area. And I'm like, what, okay, when's it appropriate to let them know that there's true evil in this world, that this can happen? Because I think if they're too young, they don't know how to process it. And it was one of those that we were talking, and I'm like, I think they're capable enough right now to be brought into this, to understand that not everyone in the world is good. And I do like in your book, you talk about like when telling kids like they should always hug or kiss their even relatives, that's not the right answer. um that that you tell them what's your what did you talk about that in the book on that subject?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's important when we're thinking about this conversation. Oftentimes, the concept of consent comes up. So we think blanketly, well, a child should be able to say no. And I would add on to that that a child should vehemently be able to say yes and vehemently be able to say no. So, what does that look like? That looks like when a child shows you affection, hopefully you've had the experience, I know I have, Rob, of maybe being away from a child for a while and they see you for the first time, they drop everything, they storm towards you, they give you a big hug. Children are not shy with their affection when they feel safe, when they feel comfortable, and when they want to give it. And likewise, if we're having to cajole our children and say, go over there and give grandma a hug, or, Uncle Tommy wants you to give him a kiss, these are things we are doing that erode a child's awareness of their own, right? We want children to grow up and have healthy sexual connections, healthy relationships, healthy partnerships. And one way that we can facilitate that as parents is by allowing them the opportunity to say, what would you like to do today? We're going to go and see Uncle Tommy. You have the choice of giving him a high five, giving him a fist bump. These are go through for your family. What is culturally acceptable? What is something that's normed? And give your child the opportunity to agree and decide, not to make that decision for them. And furthermore, just as you've illustrated, to force our child to give affection to someone is undermining their ability to say yes and ignores their ability to say no. So that is one of our starting points, is we have those open dialogues about if we feel uncomfortable, if for some reason we don't want to show that affection. And oftentimes, Rob, it's not the kids that are the problem, it's the adults. It's the adults who say, oh, well, I drove all the way from Florida to come and see you, and you won't even give me a hug. And oftentimes, what has to happen is there might need to be some adult conversation with those individuals beforehand, especially if this is a new policy in your family, to say we encourage them to show affection that they feel comfortable showing. And we're not going to force them. And we would love you to partner with us to support that, because more and more information is coming out on the idea that children shouldn't be forced to give affection, or especially physical touch, or receive physical touch if that's something that is uncomfortable to them for whatever reason. Rob, you and I have always, we've both probably been in the situation where we don't really feel like being at a dinner party or being at an event, and we do it anyway because we're adults. And when it comes to physical affection, we need to give children the leeway to give when they feel like giving, and also to retract or still be polite. I can wave to that person, I can shake their hand, I can give them a fist bump, I can blow them a kiss. There are other ways without being physical touch. But it does make me think that when we're having this conversation, I'm not as concerned about grandma. I'm more concerned with the high school teacher who's giving a back massage to the girls at the end of the day, right? I want my daughters and my sons to know at any time the physical, being the recipient of physical touch is something that you get to say yes to or no to. And if any adult or older peer touches you and it's not something that you want, you always have the opportunity to decline, to say no, thank you, to walk away, and to bring it to the attention of somebody else. I cannot tell you how many times adult survivors have come to me and said, yeah, the teacher would kiss me on the mouth. The teacher would, give me a massage. The preacher would pull me back to, the side and rub my thigh. Touch is a part of the grooming process. That is not sexual abuse. That's not necessarily even illegal. And it's frustrating as a parent and as a clinician. I want to be able to empower parents. But one of the best tools you have is the relationship you have built in your home with your child, to have these conversations and then to role play it. Say, well, what would you do if your teacher was offering to give you a back massage on the bus on the way back from a field trip? And throw that around a little bit and have that open discussion so that your child knows, oh, my mom or my dad or my caring adult or my foster parent always has my back. Because oftentimes children don't come and speak up for fear of what we're going to do, how we're going to react. And that's something that we get to own.
I just remembered part of the book that I made the mistake because I think both both of us told the kids not to let anyone touch them in their quote private areas, and then explain the private areas. But you mentioned in your book, no, that's not. You don't just say private areas, because a teacher or someone is not going to do that right away. It starts with touching the back rub, the so it's not don't touch private areas. It's don't touch unless what was your exact term on that one?
I think that teachers don't need touching for teaching. So one of the things that we have to do is we just have to allow our children and teach our children, at each stage of their development, the conversation changes a bit. So what does consent look like at 3 is going to be a lot different than what consent looks like at 13. And if we haven't even bridged that discussion, but if we've only taught them somebody else wants to touch you now, somebody else wants to hug you, somebody else wants to brush your hair, somebody else wants to pat you on the bottom, they're allowed to do that. Well, suddenly we're in a very different starting place as that child begins to individuate, become more independent, and go out into the world. And one of the things that we are talking about today is this idea of vulnerable children. But the idea of consent and body awareness and body respect follows them into their adulthood. Just as we talked about before, we want children who go into their relationships, dating relationships or friendships or first employment situations, we want them to have an awareness that there are things that are acceptable and things that are unacceptable. And in my book, a teacher massaging a child is unacceptable and it's an outlier. So again, it goes back to that idea of predators' behaviors stand out because they're not behaving like everyone else. Poll most of the teachers listening right now, and they would say, no, I've never massaged my kid. I don't need to touch them. I need to teach them math. I need to teach them science. So those teachers or those individuals who are doing those behaviors stand out. And that gets my attention. And I know it's going to get your listeners' attention after this conversation today.
So here's a question from Sweet Soul that I think is very pertinent to this one. If you could answer this question. Single mama of 13-year-old son. Would it be better for my brother to speak with my son about such things while I'm scared him for life if I do?
Sweet soul, thank you for your question. It's really reasonable, right, as parents, that we have some trepidation, some hesitation, some worry about having this conversation. But I would bet money, I don't know what you think, Rob, but I would bet money that a 13-year-old has a lot of knowledge about the idea of grooming and exploitation, especially now that they are living in 2025 with online exploitation. When we explore that as a subject matter, we find that most teens are dealing with it, have dealt with it, or have friends who are dealing with it. So I think you have a wonderful bridge as the mom to stand in your cornerstone spot of being the most important individual for your child, is to say, hey, I listened to this crazy woman talk on this podcast, and she brought up the idea of grooming. What do you know about grooming? What do you think grooming is? Start at the floor, as I like to say. Do not start in the attic, start at the floor. So bring your child into that conversation in a relaxed environment that's calm, that's easy, where you're calm, nothing else
Again,
is going
again,
on.
you give great examples of how to start. In the book, it's full of those great examples. I was watching this crazy woman on this podcast talking about grooming. I mean, it's a really benign intro to it. And again, like I said, you give great examples in the book, left and right, of how to bring up certain discussions that people might think, I don't even know how to start that. So I appreciate that. And that one, like I said, just that a very benign, way to introduce it. And you're not being accusatory. You're not like asking specifically, you're just asking what they know. And then that conversation's going to lead to something.
And I would just like to also add for Sweet Soul, if you're still listening, the idea that we sort of delegate this to somebody else is is not what I want you to do. I want you to think partnership. I want you to think your brother can partner with you to facilitate and support what you're learning and what you know to be true, so that his behavior aligns with what you know to be the expected behaviors, because you're not always around. I'm not always around my children. I have to rely on other people, but I want other people who know my stance on grooming and my awareness and etc. But if we delegate these things, these conversations, then in the event that something should ever happen, we might set our children up for not quite knowing who to go to. And they might think, well, mom is too scared of this subject, so I can't talk to her about this. Or this is going to upset mom too much, so I'll just keep it to myself. Which I know is probably the exact opposite of what you're seeking. You're seeking your 13-year-old to come to you as the bedrock. And by having this conversation bit by bit, this conversation does not happen like a brick falling. It happens page by page by page. So little bits at a time. Once you notice your 13-year-old has reached their maximum capacity for conversation, then you go about your day, do other things, and then maybe you revisit it in a few days or the following week or the following month. But just by bridging the topic, your child knows, okay, I can have these kind of conversations with mom. If something questionable comes up, whether it's with me or with their friends, because one thing I really want your audience to know, Rob and Sweet Soul to know, is that the majority of time when children do speak up about child sexual abuse, they normally tell their friends. So even if you're listening today and you think, no, Anna, this is not my issue. My children are perfectly safe. We have systems in place. That's wonderful. However, your child is going to be interfacing with other children unless you have them locked in their rooms. Therefore, it's important for us to know and teach our children, if somebody ever tells you to keep a secret about something that's happening in their home or at their school or at their religious environment, please bring it to me so that I can do the adulting and make sure that information goes to the right individuals or agencies.
Another great, like I said, every time you talk, I'm like, oh, it brings up so many good points and stuff. So here's Jenna L. And let's see, this microphone gets right in the view of my question. I feel girls are socialized to be caregivers or cooperators. Does this set them up uniquely to become prey to predators?
Well, Jenna, I have some good news and some bad news. What we find when we look historically at survivors of child sexual abuse, the majority of them are female. However, we have not often given a vehicle to adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So those numbers, if you've been watching the trends, those numbers are actually increasing of reports of childhood sexual abuse by young men, because there hasn't previously been space or room in society or culture, and we still have room to grow and still have room to improve that. One of the things that I write about in Duck Duck Groom is teaching our children that just like just like their pencil bag, right? Your children may have a pencil bag to go to school. We're wrapping up the school year, but in that pencil bag, they don't just have pencils. They have highlighters. They have, they have erasable pens, maybe. They have markers. They have crayons. They have colored pencils. And just like their behavior, different environments call for different tools. So sometimes you need to be a permanent marker in your communication with somebody, and sometimes you need to be a pencil. And what we get the opportunity to do is to teach our children, I want you to be polite, but I do not need you to be compliant. I do not need you to believe that just because you are a polite young girl or a polite young boy or any child, that you have to receive or give affection, attention, or praise to somebody else. And this applies not just to adults, but older peers. The largest growing group of sexual predators are actually older teens. So we have to be in conversation with our children about, what does that look like? What does it look like to be polite to an older neighborhood boy or to an older sibling at a sleepover? What are the ways in which you can show kindness and show your polite raising without being compliant, without saying, well, you asked me to do it, so I'm going to have to do it? And I'm so glad you brought this up, because this theme, this idea, follows them as they go into their adult relationships. I want my children to be able to say, I didn't feel like kissing after that date, or I didn't feel like giving them a hug, and so they don't do it, and giving them the autonomy of their own bodies to recognize that there's power in the no, but there's also a lot of power in the yes, and training our children just in little ways to receive or give affection and attention because they feel it, like it aligns with the relationship or the feeling that they're having at the time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think you did it. And I wanted, like, K9 Catherine, thank you for the compliment. And someone else, it is not as easy. It's a lot like, I've been on a guest on Joel's show all the time, and you just show up and, you answer a few questions. Running the show is definitely a bit different. I'm going back and forth. And I know Joel gets a lot of crap from people saying, one time he did a podcast with me about something I did, and people were kind of yelling at him on the comments because he's not looking directly at me. He's doing all these other things. And I'm trying to do the same thing, trying to listen to the answer so I can, go into that. But you also, so it's not as easy as it looks. I'm just starting to figure all this stuff out, but I appreciate the compliments. And this is a number of people have said what a great discussion this is. And I think it is one literally that everyone can use, because it's one of those things, even if your child is not having an issue, they may be getting talked to by their friends that you can then, help out on that. And then also being a sheepdog, looking out for other kids, and looking for those signs out there, especially the kids that their parents can't be at everything, that have the vulnerabilities of needing help with their kids. It's one of those things. And it was, I gave the example, and I'm not sure when I did it. When my son entered Scouts, and just knowing, I was never in Scouts very long. I got kicked out. I did something. It was probably like when we had, got introduced to pocket knives or something, but I got asked to leave. So I never went that far in Scouts. But my son got into Scouts, and was with a bunch of his really good friends, and thought it was good, but I was very, very like, wow, okay, this is where they all hang out, meaning the predators, just because what you see. And I was there one time. It was like this big regional thing, and there was a bunch of the parents that were involved in this on the stage. And I looked over at my son's best friend at the time. His mom was with me, and I said, just percentage wise, I said, there's probably two active, pedophiles, predators up there that are engaged. There's probably another 5, 6, 7 that are fantasizing about it. And there's another, so many that, it's come across. And I think her comment was like, how do you live every day thinking like that? And I'm like, well, how do you live not thinking like that was my question. But we end up going to, it was an overnight thing. I think it was Friday to Sunday morning. And the first night we're there, we're with their, I don't even know what it's called, troop or whatever. And the den dad goes up to the meeting and he comes back and he says, hey, all the kids and adults, we have to stand fire watch. Haven't been in the Marines. That's, a big thing. Someone stays up, looking for trouble when everyone else is sleeping. And I said, great. Like me and my son will volunteer for the midnight, shift, midnight to 1. He goes, well, they really want the kids to stand fire watch with an adult that's not their parent. And I looked at him. I said, what's that? The pedophile fire watch? Like, are you kidding me? Like standing in the middle of the night with someone that's not their parent? Like I'm like, that's the opportunity someone's been looking for. And he was kind of shy and he didn't want it because he's like, well, what do you want me to do? I said, I want you to go up there and say that's BS. Like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't need. And I said, what reason did they give? Well, they want to groom them. They want to get them used to interacting with other adults. I'm like, yeah, not in the middle of the night when no one else is up. Like plus I didn't want to be standing fire watch with another child that wasn't mine, because if they had something and they accused me of something that I didn't do, I've lost my job. Like you can't be an FBI agent on, with those accusations. So my thing was like, fine, I'll stand at 12 to 1. But my son's going to be with me the whole time. And then he'll stand at 1 to 2 and I'll be up with him. And we end up standing 2 hours of it just because like people didn't have the guts to say something. But it was one of those, like, I'm like, are you like, how do you not see how ridiculous that rule is? And my thing was like, someone has been fantasizing about this night that they get to stand fire watch with a child alone. And so it was one of those, we didn't last too much longer in Scouts, I don't think.
Well, Rob, your story makes me think, is it possible to bring up the gas diagram?
Oh, yeah. Yep. There we go.
Great.
Yes.
So your story illustrates this perfectly. It hasn't come up yet in our conversation, but what fuels predation is gas, grooming, access, and space. It became very clear to me sitting day after day with convicted sex offenders that they go out of their way not only to groom, but then they find themselves in positions that give them access to children, often with little supervision or no supervision, and then they have access and use their available space. So this diagram illustrates that it's at the intersection of all three. And really, when I am talking to families or agencies or individuals, it's very important that we focus in on this idea that, we've already talked about the idea that grooming is observable, therefore it's interruptible. But one of the things as a parent, I know you did this, Rob, I know many of your listeners have done this, we have to make choices on a daily basis, seems hourly at times, but we have to make choices about what environments are we placing our children. And in those said environments, who has access to our children? So let's take the example of your camping trip. A camping trip, whether it's a tent, whether it's outdoors, in a forest somewhere, the access points are numerous. What are some of the available access points, Rob, that you would think are available to a potential predator on a camping trip?
Access points is where they can be alone.
Yeah, or just be within arm's reach of that person, arm's reach of their potential targets. So you've mentioned the tent. You've mentioned
there's like campfire talks, like, there was different activities where, they would, a lot of times they circulated, like each den would set up an exercise or some type of thing. and then the troops would go from one to another. So you constantly had a group of kids coming over, and then that one adult that was running that station then had access to the kids again outside because their parents were busy with other things. So that could give it. And then there was some of them got tasked with doing certain things, like at the chow hall, cleaning garbage and stuff. And then there was always a parent, quote, supervising them. That again, you weren't with your child. So there was plenty of times that you were away from your kid that could have been because of the situation you're out camping on, that you didn't have as much visibility or observation from others.
Yes. And I love how you illustrate there that the parents are going out of their way. They're volunteering their time. I love a volunteer. I love a parent volunteer. But it's crucial that we evaluate as parents, where are environments that I'm interacting with children? Where are the policies that are not only keeping children safe, but are keeping me safe, keeping my reputation safe? You alluded to this earlier by saying, I'm an FBI agent. I'm not going to be caught alone in the dark by the fire with a child who's unknown to me without any sort of cross check or extra supervision or another adult. We should note here that the Scouts has come a tremendous way from where they were and all the scandal. They've put into place some really great methods of safety measures, 2 adults to every child. They've shortened the age gaps with children who are housing together in tents, etc. But it's very, very important that we recognize that this is twofold. This is about protecting children. It's also about protecting adults. We don't want adults to come away from this conversation and think, well, I'm never going into the school. I'm never going to volunteer with kids again. What I do want you to be attuned to is, are there access points or spaces that are not as protected based on the policies of the setting or the environment that you're volunteering in? That's something that should be upfront, that should be open. For example, like the Scouts. If you're a Scout volunteer, there is never to be a setting where children are alone with an adult and a child together. So if I'm volunteering in that environment and an adult tries to break that policy, it is my responsibility, if that adult is not intervening, it's my responsibility to call the issue to the carpet and say, that's not the policy. These policies are in place to keep us safe and to keep kids safe. And that's often lost in this conversation about child sexual abuse, that we rely on adults. We need adults to be in positions, whether it's teaching or preaching or running sports leagues. But we must have a high standard of their behavior and their actions. So the important part about understanding GAS is that grooming can be taking place. We can watch it. We can see its incremental, gradual intensity building. We can interrupt it. But we need to be attuned to who has access to my child, whether because they're a family member, they're a medical professional, they're a religious figure, they're running a sports program, and then what available spaces do they have to possibly have hands-on alone time with my child. And these are things that we as parents can assess.
Yeah, it's fun. Again, I start remembering all these things. We had a wonderful babysitter for the kids, and 4 kids is not easy, especially in our age range. And I do remember though, I never drove her home alone. If I had to drive her home and not my wife, I would bring the oldest with me, my oldest child with me. Just again, but I mean, fantastic babysitter, and I just didn't want to put my place in, to have anything be said. It's just one of those. So again, understanding that thing. But I'm going to bring up this one was a horrible. I've done this a couple times on different podcasts and on the news. Was the Sandra Birchmore unbelievable, horrific story. She got put into the Police Explorer program, and it was up in Canton, Massachusetts. And she was groomed and was passed around and ended up involved with a police officer who was married. And she got pregnant now at 22, but I think this started at 12. And he ended up killing her. And it was when I started doing the research to do the podcast and the news on this, I didn't understand how many police explorer programs have been accused of this, and it's up there with the scouts and everything else. And this is, I don't want to say any of it's worse, but here you think your kid, wants to be a police officer, and they have this program for children, and you put them into it, and this happens. Like the people that you trust most, that you always tell, find a police officer, go to a police station if something's happening. And you as a parent put your child into this, and then they are groomed and abused. And it was multiple police officers that were involved, and it horrific. And it was just, and I know a lot of the viewers are familiar with this. I've seen a bunch of comments, and that's the worst, to me. And again, it goes back to, with priests and stuff. Again, you're in this environment that you think you're safe, and you're absolutely not. And it's the worst case of some of the things that you've seen.
But Rob, I think the lessons we must take away, the opportunity that these tragedies give us, is to be aware of the fact that your title, your badge has no relative pertinence to whether or not you are in the safe category or the unsafe category. It is all about behavior. That's why we need to shift our focus from, oh, you're an uncle, so you're automatically unsafe or safe. No, you're a police officer, you're a firefighter. No. How do you behave? How do you show up in the life of my child? And if you want to switch over to the formula, because I know that your audience is doing such a good job listening. The idea that when we think about grooming, it does seem like an opportunity. It does seem sweet. I talk about grooming as a perverse form of courtship. And just like all of our courtship experiences, hopefully successful ones, it starts off sweet. It is not a weird person. It is not somebody who looks unkempt or straggly or scary. It is somebody who is kind and charming, and oftentimes has a good standing in the community. So it behooves us as parents to be attuned to what does grooming actually look like, which we'll get into with this slide. But that just because you have a title or a badge or a job of a certain role does not automatically make you safe, and it does not automatically make you unsafe. But each individual person needs to be assessed based on how they show up individually.
Yeah, that's so big, behavior based, because there's predators in every job out there. And then just some of them, they have more access. And I've seen a couple on here about doctors and the medical field, and you have a specific chapter. And again, that's why I like your book goes over a bunch of it, and then it specifically goes into family, and one of them is medical. Can you expound on that? Because I do, looking at, and this was a horrible fault of the FBI with the doctor that was in the gymnastics program, because people actually did go to the FBI. It wasn't pursued. There was people fired over that from the FBI. Because again, the people finally started going to him, and it wasn't handled correctly by the Bureau. And it's one of those things that it was a doctor thing, and and you talk about it in your book, they were actually doing it with the parent in the examination room. He was saying it was some special treatment. I know this is going to look odd or whatever, but I'm doing it for your, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't fathom having again, I think they tested it, and then they were thinking they're so bulletproof to do it right in front of the parent. I don't, I mean, I'm getting to the point where like I'm getting more of like angry thinking about some of those. But can you talk about the medical field, because you do address it in the book?
Yeah, I think it's important. So when I had to sort of decide organization of the book, it was very important to me to explore the gas idea. So one of the parts of the book is all about access and the unique access that comes through unique roles. So medical professionals, whether we're talking about nurses, whether we're talking about physicians, whether we're talking about chiropractors or physical therapists, anybody who's interfacing with our children's bodies, it's very important to note that something happens when we are in an environment with a doctor, even if we have medical training or expertise in something else. It's sort of this white coat effect, which essentially means that whatever they say, oftentimes is not something that we question. We often don't find ourselves in a position to question or a position to fight back or to disagree. And this can have incredible consequences when thinking about protecting children from a potential predator in a medical field. And you bring up a really tragic and important case with Larry Nassar. And one of the things that I would back up and say is Larry Nassar, do you know how he got into that room in the first place? He volunteered. He was a volunteer from his role as a medical expert. He gave of his time, he volunteered his time to work exclusively with these female gymnasts. Now, if you're me, I already have a yellow flag going up, Rob, right?
Yeah,
because I'm curious.
That's the yellow flag. And same thing with, like, we'll talk about it in a little bit, coaches that don't have parents on the team. I mean, don't have children on the team. To me, that was two yellow flags. I'm already like watching everything you do.
Right.
It's nice. I actually had a baseball coach. I thought back on it. We had an unbelievable little league team and we did really well. And I thought back on it, and he didn't have, he was an older guy, didn't have a kid on the team. Though I never made anything, but if I was a parent, that's again, so they volunteered. And that's, as soon as you said that, okay, either, yeah, a great guy, or you have an ulterior motive.
But even if, right, this is where we cannot assess somebody just because of the choices that they're making are one thing. I am exploring. That's why I got to show up to things, or I have somebody else show up, or I have a babysitter who's attentive who shows up, or a grandparent, because I want to see how are you interacting. Because I would bet, and I think it's a lot of it has already come out, especially about a situation like Nassar. Multiple people made reports. He had to meet with police officers. He had to meet with FBI agents. He was so confident in his excuses for why he needed to have pelvic exams and abuse these women. And nobody questioned him. And when they did question him, he was able to use his medical expertise and his role on the Olympic squad to excuse them away. And so what I'm simply asking is, you are the parent of this child. You are the expert on what is acceptable and unacceptable. One of the things I found very thought-provoking for anybody who hasn't watched Athlete A, it's an incredible documentary that's available on Netflix and probably YouTube and other things. But in Athlete A, it describes how Nassar took the appointments from the venue at the gymnastics theater, the space where they do their exercises. And he moved them where? Where did he move those, Rob? To his house. They moved him to his house. So he was then doing appointments alone with young adolescent females in the basement of his home. So if I am attentive to, again, we go back to that mantra, show up, look up, speak up. If I show up and I notice, hey, I'm seeing a pattern of behavior. I'm seeing that the young girls are going to his house. Why do they need to be at his house? Oh, I know exactly why. Because he needed to be in, if we go back to that idea of gas, he needed to have secluded space alone with these young ladies in order to exacerbate the abuse. Now, this is not the fault of any of the victims or survivors of childhood sexual abuse, but it behooves us as the adults to recognize what are those outlying patterns. And this is where the formula comes in. Because grooming starts with flattery, I'm only human. You're only human, Rob. When somebody's nice to you, when they're nice
Yeah.
to your kid, when they acknowledge that your kid is special or unique or talented, gosh, we all just sort of sit up a little bit straighter and it makes us all feel good. However, grooming takes a real turn when you look at what are the following steps. The following steps are favoritism. What is favoritism? Favoritism is all about saying, you're the only child I've ever taught who is like this. Oh, you're so special to me. You're the most special kid on this team. Isolating that child from their peer group and isolating them from their environment to say, you stand out above the rest. Okay? That, to some parents, they might think, well, that's what I want. I want mentors in my child's life who make them feel special and unique. But in stage 3, when we get to forbidden fruits, this is where potential predators will offer your child ways and means to break rules, break expectations, break societal norms. I spoke to one survivor who said, yeah, we had a man in the neighborhood who, told me I was so beautiful and pretty, and he offered to take pictures of me. Well, Rob, you and I can imagine that it didn't take too long for those photo sessions to become something that was highly exploitative for that young girl. And what forbidden fruits do is they almost they misuse a child's natural curiosity and risk taking, and they sort of entrap a child to break rules, and then with that comes the guilt and the shame. And there's a really important reason why predators set kids up to break rules and build secrets, because children who feel guilty and shameful normally stay quiet. They don't stay quiet because it is their fault. They stay quiet because they perceive that they made a bad choice, even though it was the predator's fault from the beginning. It was the predator's fault to set them up to smoke or to drink or to take pictures or to leave campus or to direct message or to have chats and send photos online that they knew otherwise their parents would not have permitted them to do. It's a strategic move on the part of the predator. And then that leads very easily into the 4th stage, which is fear. You can build in, oh, well, if you tell your parents about what we've been doing, then they're not going to love you anymore. God is not going to love you anymore if he finds out what you've been doing. The church will reject you. Mom's going to have to quit her job if I can't stay with you in the evenings anymore to babysit you. You see where this goes, Rob?
Yeah.
They've sort of entrapped the child into this web. So I'm glad that you put that up. You don't have to pull
it's
that up.
big. It's getting big now with AI that they talk them into sending a photo, and it could be a photo just of the face, and then they AI it into a very X-rated photo, and then they blackmail them that I'm going to release this if you don't send more actual photos like that. So again, it's one of those things. And also, you talk about we just brought it up again. All these ideas that pop in my head, the gaming systems, that this is definitely where predators lie, because they know kids are on the games. Parents hardly think when they're gaming that there's that much interaction with other people, but there's tons of interaction. And one of the ways that you can tell is, especially, like, they have a tendency to correct the grammar. They have a tendency to act like an adult and not like a kid on those chats. And that is a good way to determine, like, you are not talking to a 12-year-old. He's correcting your grammar. He's doing these, his messages are in perfect grammar themselves, even though a lot of them, use some of the wrong stuff. But when you look at the messages, you can, like, that's not a kid. And they don't think so. They think your child thinks they're interacting with someone of their own age. And you can look at the message and say, that's not who that is. You want to go into the gaming? Because I think that nowadays that is so big, even just online stuff, but gaming is huge.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Rob, because we're also heading into summer. And what is one of the first things that kids want to do this summer? They get rid of their laptops, they get rid of their schoolwork, they don't have any structure, or they have little or less structure. And so kids are going to be on their devices more. They're going to be gaming more. So what is unique? What's a unique access point about games? Well, games are inherently isolated. when you watch a child nowadays, whether you're in a restaurant or just out and about, you see that kids nowadays have headphones on, they have their device, their heads are down, they're engaged. We talked earlier about the idea that predators isolate their targets. The same thing is happening when we think about the gaming devices themselves. I'm not listening necessarily to the dialogue that's happening. I may not even be able to see the screen that my child is playing their game on. So, taking that as a step one, we also have to remember that games are typically engineered around gender and age groups, age categories. So if I'm a potential predator looking for a 4 to 7 year old young girl, I'm debating between a Hello Kitty game and um, some sort of a car building game. I'm going to increase my odds by going on the Hello Kitty game. And more children are being contacted through these games. Many parents are unaware of the fact that these games have embedded chats. So individuals who are interfacing on the game can also send messages to each other. And this is where we find that very skilled predators, we have to give them credit for being skilled at what they do, they are going out of their way to do things like, hey, send me a picture of yourself and I'll give you extra money within this game. There's a game called Roblox, which has its own currency called Robux. And now Roblox has introduced almost like a mall. So they've become an Amazon in and of themselves. So this is going to be a heyday for potential predators who are on Roblox, which is a gaming platform where people can make up their own games and join any game that they choose. But now that we have currency embedded into it, it's very easy for a potential predator to say, oh, I'm going to gift you this. I'm going to gift you this skin for this game. I'm going to gift you money in the game. And what do you want as a kid? You probably want to play more. You want to amp up your game. You want to amp up the likelihood that you're going to win. So we cannot fault children for acting like children. And this is where we have to support legislation that encourages and promotes more safety measures. But when you look at the research, less than 1% of the parental controls that are available on gaming platforms are utilized by parents. Now, why might that be, Rob? Well, for one thing, if you've ever tried to set parental controls, it is not swift. It is not easy. There's a lot of passwords involved and other fences, I think, that are around that. And it's not built for management. It's built for the children's attention and for their utilization. So when we know that the currency is really our kids' attention and being on the devices for longer, we are in a catch-22 with the tech agencies who are building these gaming apparatuses, which are at sometimes direct odds with our efforts as parents to keep them safe.
I wish, like, the phone, you talk about safety of a phone. And I remember we were going back and forth because I wanted my kids to be able to call me and all this other stuff. But, smartphones have so much in there. I wish Apple would come out with a phone that you could have a age-based interface where
I can't hear
every
you.
message. What's
I
that?
want to hear what you're saying, though. I know
Oh,
it's really important.
so I want to, I love it. So like if I have a child 6 and under, that I get every text message, Instagram, like I see what's happening on that phone virtually. And then as they grow older, you can have less and stuff like that. But like, it's automatic that if you have this phone and it's for a small kid that you want to give it to them for safety, that there's features in there that you get everything. And then you can take, as they get older, you obviously take some of that away, because so much is done on the phone and you're getting it for the right reason. But then there's so many ways that they can slide into having conversations that you don't know. My oldest, we had it was a program that I put on her laptop that I got everything. But she was really smart. I think she ended up probably getting around that short time later. But I saw every keystroke I could see. I mean, it's what, the FBI uses on people that we think of espionage and other stuff. But there's some things out there, but it does get tough. You have to be somewhat technical. I wish like Apple and some of the other phone companies had it so that I'm getting this for a person who's 10 and under, and everything's going to come to me and I can peruse it when I want to. And then as they get older, they get regular, iOSs or whatever it's called. Because you're getting it for the right reasons. But when you do that, you're putting them into a situation that then can, be taken advantage of.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that your comments generate in my mind is where's the partnership with technological companies and parents? When the currency is we want to keep you on for as long as possible
Yeah.
because that's how we monetize, there is no way to bridge with me as a caring mom who's like, I'm thinking of your brain, I'm thinking of your sleep patterns, I'm thinking of your intellectual quality of life. I'm thinking of the fact that you need to go outside. These are directly opposing values. So if I know that and I make a decision to provide a device for my child, I need to know that it's coming with a certain amount of risk. And if talking about that risk with my children is too scary, I may have to make a different choice. Or if I'm going to make that choice, I need to make sure that there is constant checking in, following up, because you're right, children are smart and they're digital natives. This is their norm, and for many parents, they're just catching up to what their children already know to be true.
Absolutely. So we're actually at, I told you it was going to go fast because we're at an hour and a half and 5 minutes. So I think we'll wrap this up, but I think I'm going to have you back on, and we'll have, the second episode of Duck, Duck, Groom. One, I think it's hugely important. Um, and hopefully then people can watch this. Maybe we can get some questions for the next show down the road sometime. But I do want to nitty gritty, Lorna and Jenna L. If you email me at what is it, Rob at inside the line with Rob.com, I'll send you the audio version of Anna's great book, being some of the best questions we had out there, the first question and such. So email me. I'll get those to you. I want to thank you, Anna, for just a great conversation. Like I said, I knew it was going to be a good one. And this hour and a half has just flown by. And I think everything I've seen in the comments, the same type of things that this was needed and they appreciate it.
Well, Rob, thank you for the opportunity, and biggest thanks to your listeners for listening to this conversation and taking it out into their own communities, because the way we're going to make change is bit by bit, community by community, family by family. And our children deserve this, and we deserve to feel empowered and prepared and not paranoid.
Okay, I'm gonna bring you off the show. Hang on a second. I'll meet you backstage in a minute.
Sounds
For the rest, I just want to Go Pills. A friend of mine's company, Aleco and Christian. It's a nootropics, which really helps brain function. I really support this product. When I do news, it's constantly that I never know what they're going to ask when I get on the news, and the questions come about, and I need to have that mental ability to think. This stuff's great. Again, gopills.com. If you use Rob, you'll get a discount on your order. And again, it's a great product out there. Thanks for being with me on episode 2. Next week is going to be Friday. I think I'm going to do it at around 6 or 7 p.m. A good friend of mine, Jim Tarask, is going to be on there, and we're going to talk about how we helped with the military recover a hostage that had been held by the Taliban for 5 years. And it was a crazy story on getting him. And JT is one of those guys that that show is going to fly by. I think we're going to have, it's going to be at 7 p.m. We're going to have a drink with that, because this one is going to be funny. And it's also going to be crazy. So hopefully see you next week, next Friday around 6 or 7 p.m. I'll put it out exactly what time, but thanks again. Stay safe and have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.